jurisdictional and agency representatives. I'll start with myself though. I'm Hannah Oden, Planning Coordinator with PAG. And let's go to Ben Elias. And just feel free to unmute yourself and introduce yourself.
Hey everybody, Ben Elias. I'm a project manager with the City of Tucson.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Davida Mueller.
Hi, I'm Davida Mueller. I'm I don't know what I am. No, I'm the Director of Service Planning and Development at Suntran.
All right, thanks, Davida. So I think I was jumping around a little bit on my end. Nalo.
Hello, everyone. This is Nalo. I'm the Public Works Director with the town of Sarita.
Thanks for joining us, Nalo. And then Heidi.
Heidi Lasham, CIP Division Manager, Town of Marana.
All right, thanks, Heidi. And then Jonathan.
Hi, Jonathan Crow with Pima County Department of Transportation.
Thanks, Jonathan. And then Jose Rodriguez.
Jose Rodriguez, Dunmore Valley.
All right, thanks, Jose. Mark Novak.
Mark Novak, University Landscape Architect with the University of Arizona.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Patrick Hartley.
Hey everybody, Patrick Hartley, Planning Administrator, Department of Transportation and Mobility at the City of Tucson.
Thank you, Patrick. And then Natalie.
Hello, I'm Natalie Shep. I am the Climate and Community Engagement Manager for the Pima County Department of Environmental Quality.
All right, thank you, Natalie. And then we go over to the attendee side. Mark Hoffman.
Hello, Mark Hoffman, Planning Program Manager, ADOT Planning.
Thank you, Mark. So I think that is all the non-PAG folks. So I'll move over to PAG. Jeanette.
Hi, this is Jeanette Duran, Transportation Planning Director at PAG.
Thank you. And then Eric.
Eric Kramer, Senior Land Use Data Scientist at PAG.
Thanks, Eric. And then David Zinda.
Hello, David Zinda, Economic, and I forget my title, Planning Manager at PAG, something like that. It'll be on the slides.
Thanks, David. And then Dustin.
Hi everyone, Dustin Fitzpatrick, Air Quality Manager at PAG.
Right, thanks, Justin. I'll just go through kind of our tech and admin support. Dawn.
Dawn Garcia, Administrative Associate here at PAG.
Thank you, Dawn. Jesse.
Yeah, hi there, Jesse McCrae with PAG. I'm here in an IT capacity.
All right, thanks, Jesse. And then Crystal. Oh, she might not be able to unmute, but yeah, Crystal is on our meeting support side, keeping everything running. So I'll go to Bree.
Bree Heuschman, Admin Associate.
Thanks, Bree. And then Jeff.
Yeah, I'm Jeff Hildebrand with the computer administrator with PAG.
All right, thanks, Jeff. So I think I've got everyone. If not, feel free to unmute yourself. Yeah, we have a lot of great folks on the kind of the back end. Helping us run the meeting and providing IT support today. All right, well, I think that's everyone. So we can move on to the second agenda item, which is the in-kind form. Let me just move my screen so I can read it. All right. So regional planning efforts are enhanced by recording time donated by attendees, volunteers, and participants. PAG collects data on the time dedicated to meetings and activities to apply for use as matching funds for grants and federal dollars. So if you are paid with federal dollars, please let us know now. Then time spent in preparation for this meeting will be estimated by PAG staff who are knowledgeable of the agenda and meeting materials. At the conclusion of this meeting, the session report will automatically calculate your time spent in this meeting. Time spent on the PAG RT initiatives, programs, and special projects may also be eligible for consideration for matching funds. And I'm just going to add just a quick note here. If you can't stay for the full time of the meeting, or if you do have to leave early, if you could just let us know, that would be appreciated, just to make sure that we can maintain quorum for the meeting. All right, and I think we can move on to the next agenda item, which is the bulk of our discussion today. So that's the 2055 RMAP project list. So we're actually going to get started with a presentation by Eric Kramer. Who's our senior land use data scientist, and he is going to provide an update on the RMAP modeling. So we'll get his presentation up here in a moment. And
okay. I wanted to share my screen.
You have slide control, Eric.
Okay. So there you go. Okay. Says you cannot start screen share while the other participant is sharing. Okay. All right. All right.
I think we're going to pull it up and you'll be able to have slide control. Just
okay.
To eliminate any potential glitches.
All right. Can you see my my screen now? Oh, I got to share it. I got to share it actually. There we go.
Oh, perfect.
Okay, so let me start the all right. Okay, so I'm going to go over some of the things we've been working on with the RMAP data input development. Or so our input data, we've been working on both some of the land inputs, but also the housing and employment. These are known projects. For the land use model, we consider we have a forecast that from both the housing and employment sides that acts as the control total. Now we usually give priority to allocating our forecast to the known projects first. So those will be locations, specific locations that have specific employment and housing numbers associated with them, as opposed to the model itself will make a best guess of where the highest priority or the most probable locations will be for development for after that those known projects are exhausted. So known projects we collect from both news and our local jurisdictions as well. So besides, I'll discuss our known projects, forecast and compare it with our known projects with our housing unit and employment forecasts. I will also talk about a density table update that's part of the model as well, and then what we're doing on our next couple of quarters. So we've been working on this for a while, and March and April we had a lot of meetings with the jurisdictional staff to talk about our draft of the known projects and also our density table. And then so we got feedback, and we've been adjusting those projects and making adjustments as well, additions from other sources, and also applying adjustments to the density table. Now, for the employment side of this, we used the University of Arizona Economic and Business Research Center projection series through 2052 to help take our base numbers that we have from our collected employment database and use basically those UA numbers to help us project our numbers into the future. So we're basically hitching a ride on the U of A forecast. Now, as I said, our known projects we get information from news sources and jurisdiction input. And we try to match those employment numbers. Usually they don't have industrial or industry sectors applied to them, but we have 6 sectors and we try to match those. And where we have information about the development square footage, if we don't have information about employment and we only have square footage, we can estimate our industrial sector employment using our in-house statistics that we've developed over the years. And here you see just on the bottom, let's see, just a view of how the known projects grow. Typically, they're grow the most in the first 10 to 15 years because that's the information time that we have the most information from. Later on, it may be more speculative information. So there's fewer and fewer of those. So again, diving into the employment, these graphs or these tables here are showing the net increase. This is the top one is for the regional employment forecast by the 5-year increments. Those correspond to the modeling years of the RMAP land use model and the employment sectors. On the bottom is the known projects tally as well as the ones that are being added each 5-year increment. So looking at this, we can see of our known projects, it reaches 55% of its total growth by 2035, and that's contrasts with 52% for the by 2040 for the employment regional forecast. You can see that there are some differences in sort of the phasing of this that we will need to adjust because we need to pay attention and have our employment that the model uses be in line with the control total. So we may shift the phasing of these projects or maybe also reduce across the board if that helps as well. We have to assume there is some kind of both in the news stories and also some uncertainty about the actual employment itself, and probably likely that the employment that we get in news stories or that is being predicted is sometimes over what might actually happen in the real marketplace. But so that's another reason we might want to adjust things. But our main point is that we need to be in line with the forecast. So other sectors, again, our wholesale sector is also different from the predicted forecast of the UA. But again, that's something that we will look at as well as retail. Again, that we don't have a way of predicting or incorporating loss of sector jobs into our known projects. We can't predict that, but the U of A has a longer time series that it's working with and longer trends it's working with. So those may be one of the reasons, for example, in the retail sector, while you're seeing these very low numbers here, increases in, whereas our numbers a lot higher here, at least in the first 15 years or so. Let's see. So we've added about 19,000 jobs, again, for the known projects between 2035 and 2045. And these are mostly in Tucson and Pima County. But as we get further out, we may want to look at some of those more speculative projects as well and see. But all this is depends on how these line up. Again, there's still some work to be done about adjusting this, but on the whole, our known projects represent about 43% of the total employment forecast, of which 69% is service related. Service is a broad category in our employment sectors. Okay, so for housing, again, we're using the Arizona AOEO. Please forgive me, I forget the exact Arizona Office of Economic Opportunity, I believe. Their population forecast, this is a state demographer, develops this forecast, and we have a sub-county forecast for our region. And again, we're looking at 5-year intervals. But we take that, it's a population forecast that this demographer develops, but we need to translate that into housing units. So we convert population to housing units versus by the housing unit method. So we look at the 2020 census, the housing units, the household population, the group quarters population. We apply the occupancy ratio and persons per household numbers from at each jurisdiction level to forecast our and to translate into households or housing units. So again, we're seeing in the first 10 years most of the growth in the housing, which and then it gradually levels off. We're reaching 58% of our total growth forecast by 2040. That's the total, 58 of the forecast is reaching total by 2040 versus 54% of the known projects by 2030. So this we're a little quicker than the forecast is predicting, at least in terms of our known projects. Again, we're by 2030 about 54% of our total housing units in our known projects, and 70% by 2040. And we're of the known projects, we are representing about 51% the total of our known projects, 51% of the total housing unit forecast. And in Marana, Sarita, or Valley, those are the known projects that have the highest share of the regional forecast. Okay, I'm going to move on to the density table. The density table is something that's developed in a both in a manual way when we consider things like PADs or land development communities or specific plans. We have known, or at least to the extent that we know, we have the information about what the expected build out is. We can develop what would be the target densities or the build out densities for various employment sectors and residential. Now we also, for places that are not understood or not, we don't have planned information about, we can use a sample from current densities that are near build out on parcels, and then estimate statistically what would be the target density for those, so that when the model is allocating population or allocating housing units or employment to vacant land, and choosing that land, we can say we expect the build out density to be such. So for the density table, we shared that information. We asked for feedback, and most jurisdictions didn't suggest any changes. But the changes we have, we've updated. Now it's also possible that we can modify this this table as well, seeing what the model outputs are, and if there's anything that looks unusual or not realistic, we can also at a later time modify that. So the next steps, we're in the second quarter, we're working on adjusting those known projects to the phasing to align with the forecast. And also we've finalizing the redevelopment module, and we'll be testing the land use model as well. And the input data for the activity-based model is being updated as well. We will be testing the integration of the land use model with the activity-based model. And we'll have an interim PopTech meeting on the 26th of June. And in the third quarter, we'll again continue testing the integration of those two models. And we'll have an additional meeting in August and draft outputs of the model to share. So that's all. If there are any questions.
All right, thank you for your presentation, Eric. So I'm just trying to, so it's going off my screen.
Sure.
Yeah, so if there's any questions from anyone, feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself. Natalie, I see that your hand is up, so go ahead.
I'm just curious, this item doesn't seem to be on the agenda. So how is it that we're talking about this without it being on the agenda?
So no, yeah, thanks for the question. So under the agenda, yeah, it's kind of broadly covered under the RMAP project list. It is covered under there. So provide an input data update for the 2055 RMAP. So I mean, all of this helps inform and feed into the project list and the modeling and the RMAP as a whole. So it was, it would be under the input data update. Jeanette, I don't know if you had anything you'd like to add to that, but hopefully that answers your question, Natalie.
I suppose, although it seems to me like it should be in a separate agenda item, but it's just me.
No, thanks for the feedback. All right, were there any other questions regarding this presentation? All right, seeing none, we will move on to the next presentation. And this will be, I should say that all the presentations will be posted online following the meeting, so you can always refer back to them that way. The next presentation will be a financial plan update for the RMAP. And this is really, we've talked about the fiscal constraint, and really that's what helps inform the project list, as those projects do have to meet the fiscal constraint that's anticipated for the RMAP. So yeah, Mr. David Zinda is going to be providing just some information on this, an update, and then that will help lead us into the project discussion following this presentation. So David, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Hannah, and good afternoon. It's a pleasure to join you all. My name is David, and I'm the Economic and Financial Planning Manager here at PAG. Today, we're going to talk about the financial plan for the RMAP. And as you know, one requirement of the RMAP is to make a fiscally constrained list of projects. That is, we want to be sure that the total cost of our projects does not exceed the reasonably projected revenues. So what I'm going to show you today is the forecast that I've already put through the PAG Transportation Planning Committee. These funding sources span federal, state, and local sources. They identify as well the total funding that we have to work with as we begin to consider candidate projects for the RMAP, which I think you've already likely been in the business of doing. Okay, so let's see if I can change slides. Here we go. So I've got to say, it's been a while since I initially produced these forecasts, and so much has already been done to more or less set them in stone. So with that in mind, this presentation is largely an update with no real action items from that perspective. So these forecasts were initially generated in March 2021, and when I took over putting together these forecasts, I didn't change I did change, rather, our approach compared to what had been done in the past. So it's important to note in the 2045 RMAP update and before, revenue forecasts were largely generated by PAG. Now, whenever possible, I use official sources for these revenue estimates. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a few slides and briefly compare the old versus the new. But we should note that I did summarize these changes in detail on how old forecast compared to new forecast around the July 2022 TPC meeting. Shortly thereafter, around July 2023, TPC approved the methodology used to generate these forecasts, but allowing for a few small changes. In particular, those changes included updated official HER forecast from ADOT, updated official RTA forecast from the Eller Business Research Center at the Eller College of Management at the University of Arizona. And then I also updated some federal funding baseline numbers, which informed the rest of the forecast for the planning horizon. What has not been approved, to my recollection in TPC yet, was a funding request from the city of Tucson, which I have added here. Representatives from the city asked for an inclusion of around $530 million for a high capacity transit project or projects, 50% of that coming from federal grants and 50% coming from local transit funding. As you see, I've increased that amount to $550 million, accounting for a rough inflation adjustment from 2022 dollars, which the city provided, to 2024 dollars, just to be consistent with the rest of the RMAP. So I do want to remind you of another requirement according to federal regulations. We are to list revenues in both constant dollars, in this case 2024 dollars, the value of money today, and nominal, or what they refer to as year of expenditure dollars. In other words, forecast with inflation. Year of expenditure dollars will naturally be higher than today's constant dollar forecast since they reflect inflation. And to be consistent with this requirement, I do show both constant 2024 dollars and year of expenditure dollars, and I translate back and forth assuming a 2% inflation rate over that long 30-year horizon. So 2% in recent history might seem low, but once again, we're talking about a 30-year horizon, not a short 5 to 10 year for which a higher rate could be argued. I will also note that our project costs tend to be listed on a constant dollar basis, from what I understand. This is we are considering the cost of a project we intend to build in 20 years as a cost if we were to build it today, right, in today's dollar. So in general, it's more helpful to look at my constant dollar estimates as you look through this. And you may be concerned that we are considering project cost in today's dollars for projects that may not be built years down the road, but mathematically, as long as both the revenues and the cost are denominated in the same year, it shouldn't matter. And we can ensure that our revenues do not exceed cost if we're properly adjusting our time value of money. And at least if we assume that the rate of project cost increases, generally follows the rate of inflation for our revenues. So this is our go-to slide for our high-level assumptions and summary thereof. And as you can see, federal funding is assumed across the board generally to grow at about 2% per year on a nominal basis, assuming various baseline estimates from official sources. I should note that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act increases most federal apportionments by 2% per year. And this has been the case for STBG, RTAG, and FTA grants in the PAG planning area. This was also generally true under the FAST Act. So that is why I'm using a 2% growth rate, because it's enshrined in federal legislation. This is, from what I understand, more optimistic than what even ADOT does with their federal funding, assuming a 0% growth rate. In fact, that is why ASTBG, federal funds administered by ADOT for ADOT projects in the PAG planning area, has a growth rate of 0, because that's indeed what ADOT told me they wanted me to do. Now, moving on to competitive grants, those are a little bit harder to estimate. I looked back at the last 10 years to see what money we have received in the form of competitive federal grants, federal earmarks, or state budget line item funding. So even though it says competitive grants, I'm kind of using that as a catch-all for any of this unanticipated money that comes from the government. I used that figure, kind of the average over the last 10 years, adjusted for inflation, and scaled it up by a factor of 2.5 to stretch it out over a 30-year horizon. You'll also notice that I added $275 million for the high capacity transit projects at the request of City of Tucson. That is half of the amount they requested, the other half showing up in that local transit at the bottom. As far as state revenues are concerned, both HERF forecasts are from ADOT official sources. I did not create them. They were created by economists hired by the state. I did estimate Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, and that has not changed for at least a decade. It seems, if my memory serves me correctly, that PAG gets about 267,000 each year. And that would imply a 0% growth, but I was more optimistic and assumed a 0.5% growth rate, just in case there are any increases or similar funding for this kind of program requirement in the course of the next 30 years. RTA comes from official sources. MOE, or I think that's maintenance of effort, grows at the rate of inflation by statute in the Arizona revised statutes, and I follow a similar process in extending recent revenues into the future, assuming a 2% inflation rate. Local budgets, we should note, were provided by PAG member jurisdictions for the period of 10 years. And I essentially took those estimates as provided, averaged the dollar amount over the past 10 years, put that 1 year after those initial 10 years at average dollar amount, and stretched it out through 2055, assuming a 1% real growth rate. Finally, local transit assumes 20% of recent operation funding as a baseline, which is, from what I understand, what some fare box revenue should cover. I know that those are up in question, but we assume that that funding is going to come somewhere. And then, as you could also see, as I mentioned before, I added that $275 million for the City of Tucson funding for that high capacity transit project here as well. Okay, so I know that this slide is a little bit hard to read. It's more for reference future on, or to answer questions along the way at the end of the presentation. But here we see two tables. The blue one on top shows forecast with inflation, or year of expenditure dollars. The bottom shows forecast on federal funds without inflation. I don't show every year. As you can see, I skip from 2034 to 2054, because once you know the growth rate, know the baselines, you can kind of interpolate those, and we can just see the bottom line and get the general trend. So the growth rates described in the last slide increase these forecasts from year to year on that end. The bottom is likely better to reference since project costs, as I understand, are listed in today's dollars. This table and the next one showing state and local funding, once again, are just more helpful to answer questions. So I'm going to go ahead and go on through. So here we see the state and local. Again, I won't spend too much time here, but in case you have questions on some of these estimations, we have a resource to be able to answer them. Okay. So as opposed to the last two slides, the next few might be a little bit more useful. So here we see a summary by funding source, federal, state, and local, totaling about $24 trillion. Trillion, is that billion? Sorry, that's billion. Get my B's and my T's mixed up sometimes. With inflation and $17 billion in 2024 dollars. Local funding is the biggest piece of the pie, amounting to over half of the $17 billion that we may expect to receive over the next 30 years. A large contributor to that is, of course, the funding from the RTA. Okay, so here's a summary of how funding grows over time. Blue is going to be federal funding, orange is state, and yellow is local. So on a year of expenditure basis, over there on the graph on the left, funding grows over time, but this is more or less due to inflation. Adjusting to constant dollars, we see revenues are pretty constant each year. So the big takeaway from these forecasts is that we are assuming that we will essentially have the same total amount of funding, give or take, for each year of the 30 years after we adjust for inflation. So that is, our purchasing power neither increases nor decreases, but remains constant. Now I show funding sources broken down by eligibility or restriction. And please note that this table and graph do not indicate or prescribe how we should use funding in the RMAP for actual projects. Rather, I'm just saying something like FTA grants can't be used to build a sidewalk, at least to my knowledge, or Arizona Department of Environmental Quality can't be used to build a road. So what we see here is funding according to program eligibility. Most of that funding is unrestricted and can be used for anything. I include all RTA and STBG in this bucket. HERF funding and ASTBG fall into the roadway-only funding category. FTA grants, high-capacity transit, fall in the transit category, as does MOE. RTAG falls in bike and pedestrian, and other programs is just the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality. Pavement preservation is 50% of the funding from the local jurisdictions as they provided it to me. Okay, one more slide here. Finally, I want to end with what I believe will be a question, and that question is, why is the bottom line for this financial forecast not all that different from the 2045 RMAP update, especially because we have a longer horizon? Well, there could be several different factors. Probably the biggest is that PAG now uses official forecast whenever possible, whereas before forecasts were estimated by PAG staff. In reviewing some of these older forecasts, larger growth rates appeared to be used, a little bit more optimistic. Inflation was generally assumed to be smaller as well, if memory serves correctly, because an inflation figure was used based on historical inflation, which was quite low during the generation of the last RMAP before the pandemic. One of the largest pieces of funding in the 2045 RMAP was local funding from member jurisdictions, which was estimated by PAG. It was not provided by you, the member jurisdictions. That amounted to $6.32 billion over 25 years. When I asked member jurisdictions how much funding they would provide by contrast, I arrived at $2.78 billion. So there is a very big difference just from that. So it seems like our jurisdictions were not as optimistic about funding they could provide compared to what PAG once thought a few years ago. Having that said, older forecasts made one further assumption. That is that some funds would be committed and not necessarily free money to new projects. Local funding was subject to this restriction, and only about a third of the identified $6.32 billion was listed as new money on that local funding category. Consequently, the $15.1 billion figure in the 2045 RMAP update, that bottom line, was whittled down to about $7.2 billion as new money for new projects. And certainly some of that $17.1 billion I now show will be committed to some things, but I don't think it'll be as big of a cut as the 2045 RMAP update, given how we are doing some things now and some assumptions along the way. And I suppose with that, I would be happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you so much, David, for your presentation. I'm going to pull up my attendee list here. Yeah, so if you have a question, feel free to raise that Zoom hand. So it looks like Dan Gabbio, you have your hand up. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah, and great presentation there. Just a couple of questions regarding the change in assumptions to a 2% increase for federal formula funds. Are you also assuming an increase in obligation authority for utilizing those funds?
Yes, thank you for your question. I haven't made any assumptions under obligation authority for that purpose, whether increases or decreases, but look, and especially because I'm using STBG and RTAG, we tend to generally use 100% of the apportionments available for that amount. So I kind of assume that going forward, we tend to let other funding sources like SPR and the like die out on our federal ledger. That wouldn't enter into the RMAP.
Gotcha. Thanks, David. And would it be possible to get a copy of the presentation?
Yeah, I think Hannah said this will be provided online afterwards, if I recall. Is that right, Hannah?
Yep, yeah, it's going to be provided online, and it can be a little tricky to find if you're not familiar with the PAG website. So I'm happy I can share a link to where to find it.
Perfect.
Members.
Thank you.
All right. Were there any other questions? Mark Novak, so your hand's up. Go ahead.
Yes, had a question. Whether the revenue forecasts assume passage of the RTA next, and if it does, what happens in the case that doesn't pass?
Yes, thank you for your question, Mark. We do assume passage of RTA next, and for that matter, RTA next. And if it does not pass, I'm not entirely certain. I don't know that I've talked to Hannah or Jeanette about what that would look like. Do you have any further comments on that, either of you two, Hannah or Jeanette?
Sure. Yeah, we'd have to kind of go back to square one and redo the finance plan, removing that funding stream, and then reevaluating the project list to reflect that reduction in dollars. So we'd have to reconstrain our fiscally constrained list. So yeah, that's one of the big question marks going into this cycle of the long plan update.
So that'll be clearly stated as one of the assumptions of the revenue.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was the same assumption we made in the last update as well. But yeah, we're gonna go with that, and hopefully hopefully as we draw closer to the end of this process, we'll align pretty closely with the RTA next process and get a good feel for going forward. But yeah, it could render us back at square one when it comes to developing the fiscally constrained project list.
Thanks.
Okay, any other questions about the financial plan from anyone?
Well, just wanted to make one comment. I think that the good news is by having David kind of go back and re-examine how we've looked at it, we're now looking at a little bit higher of a fiscally constrained number. We're looking at that $17.1 billion. And I think that's good news to everybody that that number has gone up a little bit. And so we'll get this presentation out, and the ask really is for you guys to look at it, analyze it, get back to us, and Hannah, myself, or David with any questions that you have. We're going to be giving similar presentation at TPC, and we'll be asking them to bless this 17.1 number moving forward. So keep that in mind and discuss with your TPC representatives and other folks there at your jurisdiction. And please, like I said, get back to us at any time with questions, comments, feedback, so that when it does get to TPC, we can have a good, healthy discussion about it. We would really appreciate that.
All right. Thanks. I'll just ask one more time if there's anything, any questions specific to the financial plan. Oh, go ahead, Patrick.
Thanks, Hannah. Just a question. It's kind of relevant now to a recent request we've been making, but in terms of estimating both the cost and the revenue in a, say, 2024 base year, does that have any impacts in the future? We've recently made an amendment request in terms of re-demonstrating fiscal constraint, because it seems like with a couple of years that have passed since the 2020 RMAP, now the kind of the landscape of the costs have changed significantly. And if we had it in year of expenditure of the project delivery, it might be easier to re-demonstrate that fiscal constraint without having to adjust other project costs. Does that make sense? So to make an amendment to bring in a new project at the year of delivery would be an easier undertaking, I think, if it was at the year of expenditure. I'm just curious if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. I can tell you from my perspective, I've only focused on this revenue side of the story without any consideration of expenditures. I think that call would ultimately need to be made by the project leads of the RMAP. But I stand ready and willing to give revenues in any denomination desired.
I understand that when we did the revenue in future years, we'd also have to inflate the project cost with those future years, and right now, but there would be a potential if we wanted to go that way that we could revisit that decision potentially. Great, thanks.
All right. Thank you, Patrick and David. All right. Anything else? We can always circle back later on in the discussion if needed. Okay, not see anything. All right. So again, we can circle back as needed as we kind of continue the conversation. But I think where we want to take kind of the focus now. So as far as the tentative in-plan project list, we're working on some updates to that based on previous feedback on the recommendations, cost estimates that we've been having throughout these working group discussions. So We'll have, a list ready here pretty soon that we can distribute for feedback. Be making some changes in the RMAP Explorer as well, as far as the proposed status, just projects that we've discussed previously are marked as tentatively in plan. You can see that in the Explorer. Again, things are still being updated, cost, project descriptions, but we will have an updated list to share for review. So there are a couple of projects in particular that we wanted to focus this discussion on. One was, it was a request at an email, I think I sent Friday, asking for feedback on the pavement preservation and reconstruction costs, and that figure, how much we want to include in our map for that project. So based on the financial plan that David just shared, that cost estimate is estimated about $1.3 billion over the course of the RMAP. Said in my email that kind of the assumption for that was based on local funding contributions. The assumption was that 50% of the local funding contributions would go towards pavement preservation. So that was the assumption made. David, feel free to jump in if I'm explaining that correctly. But so currently in the RMAP, the cost is $2.26 billion. It's project 232.08. Again, the financial plan, those estimates based on the 50% of local funding contributions are 1.3 billion. So wanted to see if, and based on the email on Friday, if anyone had thoughts on that 50% assumption, based on also the pavement preservation budget for each of your own agencies or jurisdictions. So Jeanette, I don't know if you had anything else to add to that, or anything I may have missed or context.
No, that sums it up tightly. And we recognize that email went out last week. So if you aren't prepared to provide anything, before we hop off this call, that's okay. And if you want to, walk through that a little further, that's fine as well. Just, of course, reach out to Hannah. I know we did get a couple email responses, so thank you for that.
All right. Feel free to jump in if anyone has any thoughts, and like Jeanette said, if you need to kind of spend some more time thinking about that, I can go ahead and just share my screen really quickly as well, just to pull up the RMAP Project Explorer. All right, hopefully that is sharing okay. But again, it's this 232.08 pavement preservation reconstruction region-wide multiple sponsor project. Again, this cost estimate, it's almost $1 billion higher than what the financial plan, most recent financial plan calculations show. All right, go ahead, Patrick. I see your hands up.
Yeah, so is the funding for this category really going to be restricted to what the jurisdictions have shown that they were currently spending on pavement, or would this also be looking at the totality of kind of the regional funding pie?
That's a good question. So, I mean, this was calculated based on, those local funding contributions. The other project that we wanted to look at as well was the jurisdictional discretion for local roadways throughout the region. So Jeanette, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, it is, what we're trying to do is really look at these two projects. They have really large estimates. And so we've been kind of digging around trying to figure out what they were based on, where they came from. And there's really no indication of what that might be from. So we're trying to look at it in a realistic, what do we expect there to be? And, we can make some assumptions that there might be more money than what's currently being allocated by the the jurisdictions, but we also want to make sure that we're providing adequate room for other line items in the long range plan. So we want to keep that number as close to realistic and as close to what we can reasonably expect for both of these projects. So we can make an assumption that there will be more, and I know Hannah and I have had that conversation a few times, and we're fine with doing that, but the it's almost 2.3 billion that's in the in-plan list right now is probably a little bit high.
Janet, is that a cost or funding? This was sorry.
Oh, hi, Jose. Yeah, it's a project cost that we're showing for in plan. Looks like Patrick.
Yeah, go ahead, Patrick.
Jump on in.
Yeah, no, thanks. That was helpful, Jeanette. And I understand that tension well of wanting to reflect an investment in the system needs that we have, while also recognizing this is a bit of an extraction and wanting to create capacity for the named projects for other purposes in the long range plan. So I guess I have a question and a comment. The question would be, does this cover the local street network as well? Or are we looking at just the federal aid network with this number?
This would just be the federal aid network.
Okay, so that number, yeah, it's a very different calculation because we're currently investing about this much in our streets with our propositions, but a lot of that's going to our local street network, so it wouldn't necessarily be hitting something relevant to the RMAP. The comment would be a way to look at this might be using some of the performance measures and targets that we had talked about at previous meetings and trying to identify what the desired outcome would be over the 30 years, and then coming up with kind of that investment scheme to achieve that and let that drive the cost more than just what the jurisdictions are currently putting in, at least as a grounds for discussion, knowing that kind of what does that get us in for fair or good pavement quality over the price of the plan.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Patrick. We have been working with Lance kind of closely because we're doing the pavement data collection, but also trying to look at what current costs are for the different applications and sort of what would that equate to in terms of, if we wanted to address different I don't know how to say this eloquently, but to address different pavement conditions with a specific type of treatment, that's probably a bigger analysis than we're going to have time to get into for this round. But it does give us a little bit, a closer way of ballparking it. So we've been working with him to kind of get our hands on what some of those costs would be looking like. And as we, get more of our pavement data coming in here in the next few months, that would be something that we could take a look at.
Yeah, thanks, Jeanette. I think just having a sense of that would give a little bit more context to this number and help inform that decision, either TPC or amongst this group, of kind of what that right investment level would be to be represented in the plan.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Patrick and Jeanette. In the other, so if there's nothing else on this at the moment, the other project to consider were these. We were going to take out, I believe, the non-regional, but yeah, the just roadways throughout the region, jurisdiction discretion for local roads. So this currently in the RMAP is about 2.3 billion. So quite a high number. So also thinking about getting feedback on, maybe potentially, reducing this cost, and freeing up money for other high priority projects for jurisdictions. Those were kind of the two as we were going through. There might be opportunity to to free up additional funds.
Hannah, this is Dan. Just to clarify, so is the assumption that these are all coming from funds from local jurisdictions? So it's local funding priorities there? Or is this using federal funds for eligible functionally classified roads off the interstate and NHS?
That's option 2.
Thanks, Jeanette.
Sorry to jump in. Yeah, no, and forgive me, I was right before Dan hopped on, I was speaking into my muted Zoom here. But yeah, this is one, and correct me if I'm wrong, Hannah, but we haven't really ever tied anything in the tip to this. And not that that's the measuring stick by which we put a project in the in-plan list, certainly it's not. But once again, this is another one where we think that we could put a number in here, a cost. And we've had some thoughts about that, but wanted to kind of see what you guys thought. That would sort of cover our base in this. So if there was money available and there was a project that kind of came about as a priority, this would be one way to tie it back to the long range plan. Doing that to the tune of $2.3 billion with a B, not a Z. That's, it's one of those areas as well where we want to be able to meet the intent, but at the same time, it's sort of it reads as a slush fund. It looks like, Patrick, you have your hand up?
I'm just gonna vote for Team Slush Fund here.
Yeah.
I think the intent of this, if I recall, was largely almost just a financial exercise in previous iterations of the RMAP, and it was essentially the remainder. And this was the one, not the payment category we're just looking at, but this was the category that was really just capturing what the jurisdictions were bringing in that weren't really necessarily touching the projects were in the RMAP. So I think this is a much more flexible pool of funding and should really just reflect what was reported as kind of the jurisdictional revenues that weren't being used on regional projects. I guess that's my way of supporting reducing this to match more closely to the revenues.
What the revenues would show. Okay. All
What
right.
jurisdictions reported, yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those where the intent is clear, and I think everyone on this call can kind of get behind that. Especially when we're looking at a 30-year time frame where there's like a million different variables. But at the same time, yeah, tying that to like some sort of realistic expectation is also very important. Patrick, you can just stay unmuted if you want.
I think I've spoken enough, but yeah, I guess my point would be that because this isn't necessarily getting pointed to for TIP projects like you mentioned, it really is just to make sure we're accounting for everything.
Yeah. Do you have I know it's kind of like off the cuff, but do you have a thought or feeling at what would be a good number there? I know I have mine, but I don't want mine to sway your thought.
I would actually look at it in reference to the financial plan and see what the jurisdictions reported for what their revenues were for kind of local needs. That was one of the requests that went up. I'm thinking here, this is like the money we're spending on local streets, essentially.
Yeah.
And for us, we're currently spending about 50 million a year on local streets.
Yeah. And
that time limited program, that's 411.
Dan.
Yeah, so it might be helpful just to try to put this in perspective for the group to digest a little bit better. So if I'm understanding this correctly, we've got two buckets, one for the interstate and NHS system at about 2.3 billion for 30 years, and then about the same 2.3 billion for the non-NHS system. So if you just divide that by 30 years, that's roughly 77 million per year for each, one for the interstate and NHS, 77 million, and then another 77 million for off the NHS. Is that kind of what we're looking at?
have to,
if we put it in those terms, it doesn't seem like a excessive amount of money. 2.3 billion seems like a lot of money, but year by year, that might be a bit more digestible.
good point.
No, good feedback.
Might be worth revisiting too what the local investments what the jurisdictional investments are on local streets, and maybe scaling that assumption up on the revenue side to more match this. If it's at 77 million, we're putting 50 to 59 right now in our local streets. It doesn't seem far off, but it probably also shouldn't be competing against federal aid projects.
Yeah, because that's revenue that we aren't factoring into the 17.1 billion.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where this number has been a little, there's been a lot of discussion about it in our shop, is that it's not really revenue that we're factoring into the finance plan. Those projects are assumed to be happening at the jurisdiction level with their local funding. So there's that kind of question mark hanging there.
That's what I was thinking too, Jeanette. I mean, this money, the forecast of cost is going to be the same as the forecast of revenue, because each jurisdiction is paying for that.
Right.
It's not coming from the region. It's not, because I know back in 2010, 2013, around that time, the city of Tucson used to use federal funds for surface, for resurfacing streets. They used to call it the 3R, and they used to get STP funds. But I don't think they've used it for a while now. But since it's not being used, the STP for resurfacing various streets, it's all coming from regional funds. I mean, from each jurisdiction. So I think we can lower that dollar amount.
Thanks, Jose.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead, Patrick.
If somebody else had their hand up, I apologize.
No, you're good.
Yeah, I guess my recommendation would be, let's treat this separate, and I think that's what Jeanette was getting to. Let's treat this as separate as the 17.1. Either we increase the revenue to reflect what the jurisdictions are collecting that won't be going through, say, our regional plan, or we strike it on both sides. Basically, just kind of isolate this apart from that 17.1.
That would be my recommendation to Patrick. And I'm hesitant to wipe it out completely. I'm a little bit of a hoarder like that. I could be swayed differently, but if we're not factoring it into the revenue side, then I don't know that we should reflect it in the expenditure side. So I'm tempted to pull it out. I don't want to pull it out completely, because there might be an instance that we come across where we would want something in this category. So that's kind of where I'm leaning.
That's what I was driving at, Jeanette. If you're going to get federal funds, it's got to be in there, the long range plan.
Right.
Not going after regional funds, that is STP funds for resurfacing various streets, then why have it in there?
Exactly. Dan.
Yeah, so I think it would just be helpful just to provide clarification as far as does this represent the need for available funding within the report itself? And then also, as previously mentioned, someone mentioned, tying this to performance targets, just to see if it's going to, where would it get you towards meeting those performance targets if you were to fund these, and what would happen if you didn't fund them?
I think that suggestion was made not in regards to this project, but in regards to the pavement project number. tying it to performance.
Mhm.
Okay.
All right. Is there anything else from anyone on those two specific items, projects?
Well, before we conclude, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for participating today. More discussion to come. We have a few exhibits that we're putting together that we're going to send out probably to this group before TPC, but definitely we'll be requesting some feedback from you all when those things come out. Once again, please take a look at the presentation that David gave today. We'll get that posted and out to you guys as quickly as possible. Especially to you, Dan, so we can kind of point you where we kind of keep all these things so you can find them and discuss amongst your agencies with one another, and we'll have more on this conversation to come. Hannah, back to you.
All right. All right. Thanks, Jeanette. I would just say if anyone there's anything else to add just on the RMAP project list in general as you go through your own projects, feel free to add those comments now. And if not, yeah, we will definitely follow up with the additional information that Jeanette mentioned here very shortly. Oh, go ahead, Patrick.
Sorry.
And then Jose.
Yeah. Just curious, if you have a schedule update, when are we anticipating that we're looking to bring a kind of cost constraint project list to the public or to the higher committees at a future meeting or electronic?
Yeah, actually, that's great that you asked that. We're in the middle of revising that, and we'll have an update next week at the regional council meeting.
Awesome, great. Thanks.
And yeah, and we're also, just for the good of this group, we're getting ready to launch the RMAP survey. And so we're tentatively going to do that at the first week of June. And so when that does happen, we will be reaching out to this group, but to the other TPC members, and you'll probably see promotion all over the place, but I'll definitely be reaching out to most of you to help us advertise that and make sure your jurisdictions are adequately represented in the survey. So so more to come next week.
Thanks so much for mentioning that, Jen. I can't believe I almost forgot about the survey.
Yeah.
So, all right, Jose, did you have anything? I thought you had unmuted yourself a minute ago.
Yes, I just wanted to know if you wanted us to send over the updated costs or revenue that we're going to be spending on payment preservation.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
We have a
That'd be great.
Yeah, sure. I'll send that over to you.
Thank you, Jose. We appreciate that.
Thank you. And I'll spell things out, in a follow-up email so that everyone has us on the same page. So, all right, is there anything else before we adjourn from anyone?
Right. Keep your eyes open for a doodle poll for our next meeting as well.
Thank you.
All right.
Sounds
Yeah,
good,
thank you
thanks.
so much, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Bye.
Thank you.
Anna.
Thanks, Hannah, and everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.